can use the parallels that exist between seemingly unrelated systems to understand the mechanics of each more thoroughly. We take the concept of charge for granted, as it is such an integral aspect of science and technology. However, if we ask, what is it? All we can say is charge. And if we ask, why is it? Well, we cannot say anything at all, except perhaps that it is. But this does not address why it even exists in the first place. Is it something that is simply an inherent trait of the cosmos? If we look at planets or stars or any other larger system, we do not assign any such label of charge to the overall system. And yet, when it comes to subatomic particles, we make exactly these claims. From a standpoint of universality, if charge were to universally exist, it would not only apply to specific particles that we associate with having these traits, but rather would be a characteristic found in all systems. If it is not universal, then is it logical for something to exist that only applies to a small region of observations? This draws into question the actual existence of such a thing as charge. Yet, we make observations that we associate with charge, ones that we are extremely familiar with. What then could cause these observations if they were not an intrinsic aspect of these systems? When we look at the most basic charged particles, there are telling traits that shed light onto their nature. In particular, charges have flow fields that are associated with them. For a neutral charge, there are no such flow fields. For a positive charge, the flow fields are pointed outward, moving away from the system. And for a negative charge, it is the opposite. The flow fields are directed inward, moving towards the system. This, unlike the concept of charge, which is limited only to those systems which we consider charged particles, is found in other places in nature, and thus the process itself is more universal and fundamental than the term of charge, which we assign to observance of it with relationship to relatively small particles. On Earth, when the weather is calm, a balance exists in the environment. Wind comes from an imbalance where flow moves between regions that is resultant of movement towards equilibrium. If we consider various storm systems, we can see these similarities. In a hurricane, a high-pressure region forms at the center where winds blow outward therefrom. This is the result of an imbalance that exists between the high-pressure region and the surrounding environment, which is lower in pressure. As the surrounding region is lower in pressure, particles from the central region are pushed outwards by the higher pressure and thus flow towards the exterior, causing an observed flow outward as a result. In a low-pressure system, the opposite is the case. The surrounding environment is relatively higher in pressure, and thus particles from the surrounding region are pushed inward towards the lower pressure, causing an observed flow inward as a result. When the weather is balanced, there is very little wind because equilibrium exists within the region. This means that there is no observed flow either inward or outward when balance exists. If we just claim that charge exists, then we provide no actual explanation for its existence besides that it exists. If we consider it to be the result of another trait, pressure, then we can further understand the actual mechanics of what is occurring to create the observation of charge. This would mean that a positive charge is resultant from a system being high pressure relative to its environment, while a negative charge results from a system being low pressure relative to its environment, and a neutral charge results from a system being in equilibrium with its environment. While we may think of the space surrounding particles as empty, from an infinite universe standpoint, there are always smaller particles filling the space between larger particles. The summation of these exert a force on the systems they surround, while the surrounded system simultaneously radiates a flow of particles outward into the surrounding environment. When the two forces are in balance, the observed particle exhibits the traits of a neutral charge. When the force exerted by the radiation of the particle is greater than that of its surroundings upon it, then it exhibits the traits of a positive charge. And lastly, when the force exerted by the radiation of the particle is less than that of its surroundings upon it, then it exhibits the traits of a negative charge. This suggests that charge is not a fundamental characteristic, but rather is resultant from a system and its surrounding environment. We find evidence of this, for example, on the sun. On Earth, where the density of material is lower than compared to the sun and its gravitational influence is lower, particles that exist on Earth are in a lower energy density environment. Thus, a hydrogen nucleus exhibits characteristics of being a positive charge because it is not in balance with the lower pressure environment. However, hydrogen nuclei on the sun do not exhibit the trait of being a positive charge, but rather they exist as if they are neutral in the form known as plasma. On Earth, a hydrogen nucleus requires a negatively charged particle for equilibrium, while on the sun, by itself, it exists in equilibrium due to the high pressure environment. In the same way, we ourselves depend on our environment. We are not inherently positive nor negative, reactive nor non-reactive, but rather we can be anything depending on the environment we find ourselves in. If we are high in energy and our environment is low, then we can be perceived as positive and vice versa. However, all things are relative. If we move into a higher energy environment, we can find ourselves as exhibiting traits of negativity. In each case, we can become reactive in the same way as an atom can be reactive with its environment to form equilibrium. When we are in balance with our environment, then we are not reactive, not simply because it is an inherent trait of us, but rather because we depend on our environment in this way and can function as any relative state in a given environment.